Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval royals who ruled kingdoms by day and floated peacefully through alternative realities by night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you hear the name Queen Isabella of Castile, you probably imagine a stern, unstoppable force of political will, the woman who unified Spain, funded a confused Italian sailor who thought he reached Asia, and glared Europe into submission. But beneath the iron rule and religious intensity, Isabella kept another kingdom under control. Her personal pharmacy, which would make a 21st century wellness influencer pass out from shock. Being queen was stressful. You had crusades to coordinate, nobles to threaten, treaties to sign, and at least 5 people per day trying to overthrow you before lunchtime. So Isabella did what any overwhelmed ruler in the 15th century would do. She opened her herbal cabinet, a cabinet filled with medieval medicine that worked suspiciously well and probably violated modern narcotic laws in 17 different countries. Take insomnia, for example. Today, you'd drink chamomile tea. Isabella. She got served opium tea, not a gentle bedtime blend, but a sleeping draught so powerful it could put a warhorse into a coma. Feeling stressed before a diplomatic meeting? Isabella's doctors reached for cannabis-infused balms, because apparently international relations were best handled while your shoulders melted into the throne. But the real star of her medical lineup was mandrake root. Medieval people believed mandrake screamed when pulled from the earth, excellent sign, could cure any ailment, less excellent, and could sedate even the most anxious monarch. Isabella drank mandrake preparations the way modern people drink lattes, regularly, confidently, and with only mild fear of hallucinating an angel in the corner of the room. And then there was henbane. Henbane was supposed to relax the mind. In reality, it relaxed you so hard that your mind briefly packed its bags and left. Yet physicians insisted it clarified judgment. Sure, nothing sharpens political decision-making quite like a mild medieval out-of-body experience. There is something wonderfully human about imagining Isabella, the queen who reshaped the world map, sitting in her chambers after a long day, holding her cup of medicinal opium, thinking, maybe I can run an empire and ascend to heaven simultaneously. And the best part, all of it was considered completely normal. No one whispered, "Your Majesty, perhaps this is too strong." No. They said, "This will balance your humours," which was medieval medical slang for, "We have no idea what we're doing, but this stuff knocks people out beautifully." So yes, Isabella conquered kingdoms, launched voyages, reshaped continents, all while occasionally drifting several inches above her throne on the strongest herbal cocktails medieval science could legally mix. If medieval Europe ever hosted a most likely to drink something he shouldn't competition, King Charles the Bad of Navarre would have won by several miles, and probably accepted the trophy while high on something brewed by his court alchemists. Charles didn't get the nickname the Bad for being evil. He got it because he made decisions that ranged from dangerously impulsive to, "Sir, please step away from the potion." His political plans were chaotic, his alliances unpredictable, and his personal wellness routine, a medieval chemistry experiment gone horribly or hilariously wrong. Where other kings relied on faith, discipline, or competent advisors, Charles trusted alchemy, the medieval version of science, but with much stronger personality issues. His personal alchemists specialized in potions that promised everything: heightened intellect, improved mood, spiritual clarity, political courage, and, on one memorable occasion, immortality. These mixtures contained delightful ingredients like opium, hashish, hallucinogenic plants, exotic resins that had travelled farther than most peasants ever would, and powders that no one had business inhaling unless they had a death wish or a crown. Charles did not sip these potions cautiously. No. He consumed them with the enthusiasm of a college student discovering energy drinks for the first time. The results were impressive and occasionally catastrophic. One potion reportedly made him so euphoric he tried to negotiate peace with a tapestry. Another gave him visions that he insisted were divine messages from the heavens. His advisors nodded politely, wrote down his ramblings, and tried not to panic when the king began describing conversations with imaginary diplomats. His court physicians, bless their optimistic hearts, insisted that these herbal concoctions would balance the humours. Instead, they unbalanced everything: his emotions, his sleep, his decision-making, and arguably his entire kingdom. And yet, Charles kept drinking them, because to him, these brews were not recreational. They were strategic tools. If a potion made him fearless, he'd wage war. If a potion made him paranoid, he'd accuse neighbouring rulers of plotting against him. If a potion made him glow with cosmic self-confidence, he'd declare sweeping reforms that no one understood. Eventually, even foreign ambassadors learned the signs. If Charles greeted them calmly, he hadn't visited the alchemy lab yet. If he greeted them while sweating, trembling, or quoting prophecy, they knew negotiations were about to get very unpredictable. So yes, Charles the Bad was not just a king. He was medieval Europe's most committed potion taster. And in a world without warning labels, he explored the limits of alchemical medicine with heroic, or reckless, enthusiasm. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, crusader, philosopher, falcon enthusiast, multilingual genius, basically the medieval version of a walking Wikipedia page, also had a lesser-known hobby. Sampling any herbal or chemical substance his scholars claimed would expand the intellect, which, in medieval science, meant absolutely anything. Frederick surrounded himself with scholars from across Europe and the Islamic world, men who studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and most importantly, experimental narcotics. These physicians carried jars full of powders, tinctures, scented oils, resins, and dried plants that looked suspiciously like the ingredients list for an ancient rave. But Frederick was curious, dangerously curious. Where other kings asked, "Is this safe?" Frederick asked, "What will happen if I take two?" His scholarly advisors, who should have known better, encouraged this curiosity. In their defense, they sincerely believed these mixtures opened the mind to higher understanding. In practice, they opened the mind to conversations with falcons, hallucinations of angels wearing questionable fashion choices, and entire nights spent debating philosophy with people who had definitely left the room. Frederick's favourite substances were aromatic resins and herbal vapours used by Arab physicians during surgery and meditation. These fumes induced calm, clarity, and, if inhaled long enough, the sensation that the imperial ceiling had started breathing. Frederick would sit in these fragrant, haze-filled chambers, pondering law, science, religion, and why exactly his hands looked so interesting. It's no wonder the Pope once called him the Antichrist. He probably smelled the incense cloud drifting from Frederick's tent and thought, "That man is seeing God in ways we did not authorize." Frederick also experimented with hashish preparations, brought by scholars who insisted it improved concentration. And to be fair, it did, at least until Frederick's concentration drifted into contemplating metaphysics so intensely that he forgot an entire council meeting while sitting in the same room. And the best part? Frederick conducted experiments on his own reaction to every substance. He documented effects, sensations, mood shifts, even philosophical insights. It was medieval journaling. Except every entry probably began with, "Today I have discovered that time is fake." His court learned to adapt. If Frederick floated into a room, smiling with cosmic serenity, they knew not to bring up taxes. If he stormed in quoting Aristotle, they knew he'd tried a stimulant. If he wandered in slowly petting a falcon while muttering about the nature of existence, well, that was just a regular Wednesday. Frederick was brilliant, eccentric, unpredictable, and occasionally very, very high. If medieval courts had Yelp reviews, the Byzantine palace would have 5 stars for ambience, lighting, and absolutely overwhelming incense usage. And no one embraced this aromatic lifestyle more enthusiastically than Empress Theodora, a woman who ruled an empire, survived palace intrigue, and inhaled enough perfumed fumes to accidentally astral project during morning prayer. In Byzantium, incense wasn't a small accessory. It was a cultural obsession, practically its own branch of government. Palaces, churches, corridors, throne rooms, everywhere you walked, clouds of scented smoke swirled like the empire's version of mood lighting. Theodora loved these rituals. They were elegant, sacred, and occasionally strong enough to make you forget your own name. The fumes themselves? Not your gentle lavender spa oil. We're talking blue lotus resin, a known psychoactive. Opium gum, used to enhance contemplation. Cannabis oils, infused into burners as part of purification rites. And even incense from Persia and Egypt, so potent priests needed to open windows or risk floating out of their bodies mid-liturgy. Now, Theodora didn't inhale all this intentionally to get high. She inhaled it because it was everywhere. It was the palace equivalent of breathing. But when your palace air quality can be described as scented soup, effects are guaranteed. Picture Theodora sitting on her throne, receiving ambassadors from foreign lands. They enter the hall, eyes watering, noses overwhelmed, trying not to cough while a fog of psychoactive aromatics fills the air like a mystical smoke machine. Meanwhile, Theodora, accustomed to this every day, sits perfectly serene on the throne, exuding an aura of divine enlightenment. The ambassadors probably thought Byzantine emperors literally levitated. Her advisors often reported that Theodora entered states of heightened spiritual perception. Translation: the incense was working overtime, and court ceremonies were even stronger. Some rituals burned so many psychoactive resins that choir boys got dizzy, and monks saw halos around everything, including the furniture. Theodora participated with regal composure, occasionally receiving visions or prophetic insight. Whether these insights came from God, genius, or the vapors is still an open scholarly debate. In private, her bathhouse rituals involved herbal steam infused with narcotic flowers that relaxed the muscles, eased stress, and probably made the palace walls breathe slightly if you stared too long. So yes, Theodora ruled an empire with sharp political instincts and fierce intelligence. But she also spent years breathing an incense haze so thick it could double as medieval anesthesia. If anyone in medieval Europe deserved an award for most unexpected ways to get high, King Philip the Fair of France would absolutely receive it, and he'd accept it inside a cathedral, surrounded by priests waving incense burners the size of medieval kettles. Philip the Fair was famous for many things: bankrupting the Knights Templar, picking fights with the Pope, and being unreasonably attractive according to every chronicler who ever wrote about him. But what people forget is that Philip spent an astonishing amount of time in church. And these weren't mild, quiet church sessions. These were full medieval liturgical extravaganzas, where the incense wasn't just present, it was aggressively unavoidable. Medieval church incense was nothing like the gentle sandalwood you find in modern yoga studios. Oh no. This was a powerful mixture of frankincense, myrrh, psychoactive tree resins from the Middle East, benzoin, storax, and occasionally herbs that encourage divine visions, which is a polite ecclesiastical way of saying, sit too close and you will absolutely start seeing angels tap dancing on the altar. And King Philip didn't sit in the back row. Philip sat front and centre, directly under the incense clouds, for hours. Imagine the scene: a grand cathedral filled with chanting monks, sunlight pouring through stained glass, and plumes of thick incense swirling dramatically around Philip's head like he's the main character in a medieval music video. While everyone else is quietly praying, Philip is inhaling enough aromatic resin to communicate with the Holy Spirit in surround sound. Priests insisted the purpose was spiritual elevation. Philip took that very seriously, sometimes a little too seriously. Chroniclers describe Philip as deeply contemplative during Mass, often entering states of intense focus, staring fixedly at a single point on the wall as if decoding heaven's Wi-Fi password. Some diplomats claimed he occasionally emerged from ceremonies glowing with inspiration. Others said he emerged glazed over and smiling mysteriously, which is historian speak for medieval incense hit him like a truck, and he attended Mass constantly, not once a week, but daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Which means Philip spent a significant portion of his royal life in a haze of sacred fumes, potent enough to tranquilize a camel. Did he enjoy it? Absolutely. Did it influence his judgment? Let's just say outlawing the Templars and arresting a pope were very bold moves, and perhaps not the kind one makes completely sober. So yes, Philip the Fair ruled France with strategic brilliance, political ruthlessness, and a respiratory system perpetually filled with holy smoke. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was many things: political mastermind, cultural icon, mother of kings, and the undisputed queen of making medieval men extremely nervous. But there's one part of Eleanor's life that rarely gets mentioned: her love of wine. And not just any wine. Medieval wine. Enhanced wine. Wine fortified with more herbs than a witch's pantry. See, medieval wine wasn't the delicate stuff you swirl gently while discussing philosophy. Medieval wine was basically grape juice with commitment issues. It was strong, unpredictable, and often improved with herbal additives designed to boost mood, stimulate creativity, or knock you out cold depending on the blend. And Eleanor? She lived in Aquitaine, the wine capital of medieval Europe, a land where everyone had opinions about vintages, barrels, and grapes, and where the court poets were only as good as their nearest bottle. Court records describe Eleanor hosting feasts where the wine flowed freely, and came mixed with delightful additions like wormwood, which made the mind wander into interesting and occasionally alarming places. Hyssop and rosemary, which lifted the spirits. Poppy syrup, which guaranteed you would sleep like a blessed corpse afterward. Cannabis seeds, steeped in wine to encourage poetic invention, a medieval phrase meaning you will absolutely write something dramatic tonight. It wasn't recreational, it was courtly culture. A sophisticated excuse, really. Imagine a court poet nervously performing for Eleanor. She sits with her golden hair braided into a crown, sipping a goblet of herb-infused Aquitanian wine that could knock the armour off a Templar, nodding slowly as she evaluates whether the poem is brilliant, or if she just can't feel her face anymore. And the troubadours loved it. They claimed Eleanor's wine unlocked inspiration, which is medieval code for we drank something and started rhyming uncontrollably. Entire poetic movements were born because someone poured too much wormwood into the barrel. But Eleanor wasn't using these concoctions for escapism. She used them for strategy. A relaxed court is easier to control. A creatively inspired court produces better propaganda. And a mildly intoxicated diplomat is far easier to win arguments against. Plus, let's be honest, if you'd married King Henry II, you'd probably need a drink too. Eleanor's enhanced wine wasn't a weakness. It was a political tool, a cultural signature, and occasionally a spiritual journey. And through it all, she remained one of the most powerful and sharp-minded rulers of the medieval age, even if her wine occasionally had the kick of a small dragon. King Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, had a reputation for being pious, disciplined, noble, charitable, and occasionally so spiritually elevated that people wondered if he was communing with angels or simply over-scented with medieval medicinal herbs. Spoiler. Probably both. Louis took religion seriously. Very seriously. Pathologically seriously. If holiness were a competitive sport, Louis would have won by such a margin the Pope would have to start drug testing. But medieval sainthood didn't just come from charity and crusading. It also came from medicinal concoctions cooked up by court physicians whose idea of help involved stuffing sedatives into anything that moved. And when Louis experienced stress, which was often because ruling France in the 13th century was basically living inside a non-stop group project, his doctors prescribed spiritual calming treatments. Translation: medieval herbal potions strong enough to make a statue blink. Lewis's medical lineup included poppy-based syrups, which monks labelled sleeping cordial, but which modern doctors would call, please do not operate heavy machinery after drinking this. Valerian infusions, meant to quiet the mind, but also capable of quieting your ambition, personality, and probably a small village. Henbane extracts, which opened the mind to spiritual truths, usually right before closing the mind to basic motor skills. Myrrh and resin vapours, burned during devotions, thick enough to make the chapel look like a medieval rock concert. The result? Lewis often slipped into contemplative trances, so deep his advisors sometimes had to wave their hands in front of his face to check whether he was having a divine revelation or just extremely relaxed. Chroniclers, who were far too respectful to call their future saint medicated, instead described these episodes as periods of severe devotion, which is medieval historian code for the incense did something. His intense prayer sessions frequently lasted hours. He knelt motionless, eyes half closed, basking in clouds of resin smoke, whispering prayers, visions, or possibly recipe ideas. Nobody could hear him clearly over the incense burners hissing like medieval humidifiers. Foreign diplomats who attended these ceremonies reported feelings of euphoria, lightness, and holy dizziness. One ambassador admitted he forgot why he had come and simply joined Louis in prayer. The incense absolutely worked. But here's the twist. Lewis's judgment remained sharp. His administrative decisions were famously fair, his justice system admired, and his reforms lasting. So either the herbs sharpened his saintly instincts, or he was the only man in history to run a country from inside a mildly narcotic haze and still do it better than his sober rivals. In the end, Louis didn't get high for pleasure. He got high for God, which in medieval Europe was the most respectable excuse imaginable. Emperor Basil I began life as a stable boy, rose to power through charm, talent, and one very suspicious series of promotions, and eventually ruled the Byzantine Empire with the confidence of a man who absolutely believed God was on his side. And to be fair, Basil was often on his way to feeling divine, thanks to one of the empire's most beloved psychoactive imports, blue lotus. Blue lotus, a fragrant Egyptian flower, had been used for centuries in rituals, medicine, and elevated social gatherings, which is historian speak for the ancient world's favourite mild hallucinogen. Basil adored it, not because he wanted to party, but because the palace absolutely drowned in the stuff. Incense braziers, bathhouses, perfumed oils, ceremonial garlands. The blue lotus was everywhere, turning Basil's daily routine into a pleasantly floaty sensory experience. Imagine waking up as emperor. You step into your bath, blue lotus steam. You walk through the palace, blue lotus incense. You sit on your throne, attendants waving fans dipped in blue lotus oil. By lunchtime, Basil wasn't just emperor. He was gently levitating emotionally, spiritually, and probably politically. Chroniclers say Basil had a serene composure and a calm authority. Of course he did. It's easy to stay calm when the air around you smells like an ancient spa and your brain is receiving soft floral whispers of shh, don't worry about the taxes. Foreign ambassadors who visited Basil's court frequently noted the ethereal atmosphere, a polite way of saying the throne room resembled a perfumed fog machine set to maximum. Some envoys left meetings so relaxed they forgot to deliver half their diplomatic messages. One Venetian diplomat wrote that audiences with Basil felt like meeting a god in a cloud of perfume. Translation: the fumes hit him harder than expected. Did Basil intentionally seek out these effects? Hard to say. Blue lotus was culturally embedded in Byzantine ritual, especially among the elite. In bathhouses, the heated air infused with lotus oil created a dreamy haze, perfect for discussing politics, philosophy, or which general needed to be fired next. But Basil definitely enjoyed the aesthetic. He commissioned perfumes, reordered ceremonial incense blends, and reportedly preferred lotus-scented halls over normal air. Because why breathe boring oxygen when you can breathe something with personality? And the best part? Basil governed surprisingly well. He reorganized finances, strengthened the army, and founded a dynasty, all while living inside a fragrant, mildly psychoactive botanical cloud. So yes, Basil I wasn't just the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. He was Byzantium's most elegantly relaxed emperor. King Richard the Lionheart is remembered as a crusading hero, a military genius, a man whose preferred communication style was loud sword noises, and someone who spent approximately 3 days of his entire reign actually in England. What people forget is that Richard's life was a non-stop conveyor belt of injuries, and medieval medicine handled those injuries with the delicacy of a brick through a window. Richard fought constantly. Siege warfare, skirmishes, duels, battles, tournaments. If violence were a loyalty program, Richard would have reached platinum status in a week. Naturally, he accumulated wounds like a medieval hobby. Arrows, swords, lances, friendly fire, unfriendly fire, you name it, he got hit by it. And because medieval medicine had not yet discovered anesthesia stronger than bite this stick, Richard's doctors relied heavily on opium-based treatments. And when I say based, I mean almost entirely opium. After battles, Richard's medical tent resembled a medieval spa run by someone who had heard about modern pharmacology only through vague rumours. Physicians prepared syrups, poultices, salves, and drinks with so much opium that Richard probably achieved spiritual enlightenment several times without meaning to. Imagine the scene. Richard lies on a table, bleeding, annoyed, and refusing to stop giving tactical orders. A physician approaches with a cup. "Drink this, sire. It will ease the pain." Richard, "Does it also make me invincible?" Physician, "Probably not, but you won't care anymore." Even during long sieges, Richard's pain treatments included poppy wine, essentially medieval NyQuil with delusions of grandeur. Soldiers reported that after taking his medicine, the king would sit upright, calm, composed, and vaguely glowing, offering brilliant military strategies or occasionally reciting poetry at the wall. His most infamous injury came in 1199, when he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. Medieval surgery ensued, which involved heated metal instruments, prayers, screaming, and, blessedly, opiate sedation. Richard reportedly remained shockingly calm throughout the procedure, proof that either he was superhuman or the opium dose was strong enough to tranquilize a cavalry horse. And yet, throughout all this, Richard's leadership remained sharp. He negotiated truces mid-siege, led armies with terrifying charisma, and terrified enemies even while bandaged like a medieval scarecrow. In truth, Richard didn't use these substances recreationally. He used them because medieval warfare was basically a full-time attempt to destroy your skeleton. But thanks to medieval medicine's strongest herbal offerings, the Lionheart marched, fought, ruled, and occasionally floated. Queen Joanna of Castile, better known by the unfortunate nickname Joanna the Mad, has long been portrayed as emotionally unstable, dramatic, hysterical, or simply too much for the men who wrote her biographies. But the truth is far less insulting and far more medieval. Her court physicians kept giving her medicinal cocktails so potent they could tranquilize a choir. Joanna lived under enormous political pressure. Her husband betrayed her, her father manipulated her, her son imprisoned her, and half of Europe whispered behind her back like a medieval reality TV cast. So naturally, her doctors decided the solution to her stress was to make her relaxed, which, in medieval medical language, meant chemically launching her into orbit. Her treatments included opium syrups for emotional agitation, also known as "Good night, Your Majesty", cannabis oils applied as balms or placed under the tongue to soften turbulent thoughts, henbane teas, which induced both calmness and the philosophical realization that the floor had interesting textures, nightshade microdoses, the medieval equivalent of asking, "What if we accidentally poison the Queen?" but in a helpful way. Even better, Joanna rarely had a say in any of this. If she cried, they gave her a sedative. If she argued, they handed her another draft. If she tried to explain complex political thoughts, some court doctor nodded softly and said, Yes, yes, drink this. And Joanna, smart, articulate and exhausted, usually cooperated. Chroniclers later described her as unstable. But let's be honest, if you spent decades being force-fed medieval anxiety medication, locked away from your children, and surrounded by political vultures, you wouldn't be walking around like a serene Disney princess either. Imagine her daily life. Joanna sits near her window, frustrated with her circumstances. A physician scurries over, holding yet another potion. Your Majesty, it will calm your nerves. Joanna. My nerves are fine. I need constitutional authority. Physician. Yes, yes, drink the potion. Within minutes, Joanna is calmer. Not happier, not healthier, but calmer. Because the mixture she drank is roughly equivalent to being tackled by a very polite elephant. And the tragedy? The more sedated she became, the more men around her claimed she was unfit to rule. Joanna wasn't mad. She was medicated into oblivion by a court that benefited from her silence. So yes, she lived part of her life in a soft cloud of medicinal haze. Not because she wanted to, but because the political system preferred her that way. King Henry IV of England had one major problem. He could not sleep. And not just, I stayed up too late doom-scrolling insomnia. This was medieval kingdom-crushing insomnia. The kind where a king stares at the ceiling for 8 hours thinking about rebellions, unpaid soldiers, and whether God is mad at him personally. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Henry's doctors were determined to help. And medieval physicians believed that when the mind cannot rest, you must blast it into rest using substances so aggressive they could knock out a cathedral. So Henry was given a rotating menu of medieval sleeping aids, including poppy milk, a thick white opiate mixture that monks described as a blessing, and modern pharmacists would describe as, please absolutely do not drink this. Mandrake wine, brewed from a root believed to scream when dug up, always a great sign for medicinal safety. Henbane sleeping draughts, capable of inducing calm dreams, chaotic dreams, or occasionally no dreams because you skipped straight to unconsciousness. Valerian and lavender steeped ale, for nights when they pretended to be gentle. Imagine being Henry. It's midnight, your kingdom is on fire metaphorically, and sometimes literally, and the royal doctor walks in carrying a cup that smells like a wizard's compost heap. Drink this, sire. It will ease your troubles. Henry. Will it? Doctor. I have no idea, but you will definitely stop complaining. And the potions worked, sometimes too well. Chroniclers noted Henry often fell asleep at awkward moments, during council meetings, during mass, and once reportedly during an argument about taxation, which honestly might have been intentional. But these weren't peaceful, serene naps. Medieval sedatives hit like a trebuchet. Henry would go from wide awake to horizontal in seconds, only to wake up groggy, confused, and vaguely glowing from the herbal residue. His sleep problems only worsened with age. Stress, illness, and politics turned Henry into a man who practically lived on medicated potions. Each new rebellion meant a new dose. Each new political disaster meant a stronger mixture. His physicians responded to national crises by stirring potions faster. And the irony? Henry wasn't a weak ruler. He was competent, strategic, and stubbornly effective. But insomnia made him volatile, irritable, and prone to pacing the halls at night like a ghost haunting its own castle. So yes, Henry IV spent much of his reign drifting between exhaustion and potion-induced unconsciousness, a king ruling England on the medieval equivalent of prescription sleep grenades. Queen Catherine de Valois, mother of the Tudor dynasty and accidental founder of half of England's future royal drama, had one consistent approach to stress management: fumigation therapy, and not the gentle eucalyptus mist you find in modern spas. No, Catherine enjoyed the medieval version, which was essentially sitting in a small heated room being slow-cooked in psychoactive vapour. Fumigation chambers were fashionable among the medieval elite. They were meant to cleanse the body, calm the spirit, and soften emotional imbalances. In practice, they functioned like herbal hotboxes designed by someone who had never heard the phrase ventilation. Catherine's chambers burned cannabis resin, opium-infused oils, henbane smoke, and various mysterious royal herbs that physicians swore were medicinal, even though none of them could explain why everyone left the room walking into door frames. Imagine Catherine entering the chamber after a long diplomatic disaster. She sits gracefully, a queen ready to unwind. The attendants close the door, a door that seals tighter than a medieval tax collector's purse. Then they ignite the herbal mixture. Slowly, the room fills with thick, aromatic smoke, the kind that makes you question whether the walls are melting, or if your problems simply don't exist anymore. Within minutes, Catherine is experiencing relief, which is medieval medical language for "Your Majesty, you probably won't feel feelings for at least 2 hours." Her physicians wrote lovingly about how the fumes loosened the humours, relaxed the womb, and freed the mind from sorrow. Modern translation: we invented aromatherapy but accidentally made it narcotic. Court attendants occasionally had to escort Catherine out because she stayed too long and began philosophising with the furniture. One chronicler politely noted that after fumigation sessions, the Queen spoke with great gentleness and contemplation, which is a very diplomatic way of saying she was absolutely floating. Even ambassadors noticed. One Burgundian envoy described Catherine's presence as serene, luminous, and slightly unsteady. Another wrote that speaking with her felt like conversing through a warm cloud. These men weren't poets. They just survived second-hand exposure. But the most entertaining detail? Fumigation was prescribed for romantic vitality? Yes, that kind. And considering Catherine famously married Owen Tudor in secret, then launched a new royal bloodline, one might argue the fumes worked a little too well. So, while Catherine de Valois ruled with grace and left a dynasty behind, a good portion of her emotional stability came from sitting calmly in a room filled with enough herbal smoke to tranquilize the Archbishop of Canterbury. King Alfonso X of Castile, known to history as Alfonso the Wise, earned his nickname not because he behaved wisely, but because he surrounded himself with scholars, astrologers, translators, poets, magicians, and absolutely anyone who could teach him something, whether that something was astronomy, or how to brew a trance-inducing herbal tea in the palace basement. Alfonso believed that knowledge came from 3 places: books, the heavens, and drinking whatever his court philosophers handed him. And since medieval scholars were fond of experimenting with consciousness, altering herbs for research, Alfonso became the lucky royal volunteer for half of Iberia's intellectual science projects. His court brewed concoctions made from mugwort, used by astrologers to open the mind to the stars, or to make you think constellations are winking at you. Mandrake microdoses, because Alfonso believed it unlocked mathematical clarity. Blue lotus and cannabis teas, popular among Andalusian scholars for inducing meditative states. Myrrh and cinnamon infusions, which were supposed to stabilize the humours, but mostly stabilized Alfonso into not standing up for a while. If you walked into Alfonso's palace on a typical evening, you'd find a group of scholars sitting cross-legged on cushions, passing around scrolls and herbs in equal proportion, while Alfonso took detailed notes like a man preparing for an exam assigned by God. He wasn't getting high for fun, he was getting high for research. Imagine him listening to a scholar describe a new herbal blend. "Your Majesty, this one encourages astral insight." Alfonso: "At last, something that might help me rewrite the legal code." And he did rewrite the legal code. Spain's most influential medieval law book, the Siete Partidas, was developed during this era of mystical scholarship. Some of those laws are so philosophical that you can absolutely tell someone was sipping something herbal while drafting them. Alfonso also studied astrology with such devotion that he held nighttime sessions under the stars, often after drinking vision wine, a mixture strong enough to make anyone think they understood planetary motion. And honestly, his astronomical tables were shockingly accurate, proof that either the herbs worked, or medieval Spain ran on pure chaotic genius. Foreign visitors described Alfonso as deeply contemplative, intensely focused, and occasionally lost in thought for long intervals. Translation: the king tried another experimental tea and is now communicating with Jupiter. But here's the thing. Alfonso was brilliant. He wrote poetry, commissioned translations, advanced science, unified legal systems, and preserved ancient wisdom. He just happened to do it while occasionally hovering at the outer edge of consciousness. Empress Irene of Byzantium was many things: shrewd politician, occasional usurper, enthusiastic blinder of rivals. But she was also a woman who spent so much time surrounded by incense that her entire reign might as well have taken place inside a perfumed fog bank. If you've ever walked past an overly enthusiastic incense booth at a festival, imagine that. But make it imperial policy. Byzantine religious and political life revolved around ceremonial incense, and Irene took those ceremonies seriously. Very seriously. Her court burned mountains of the stuff. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, storax, benzoin, resin from distant mountains, and, depending on the ritual, herbs known for their vision-enhancing effects. In the 9th century, vision-enhancing is code for "Your Majesty, you may see God," or something that vaguely resembles him. When ambassadors visited, Irene ensured they encountered a majestic haze of fragrant smoke so thick it could hide an entire infantry unit. Diplomats walked into her throne room blinking, coughing politely, and trying not to trip over furniture they could no longer see. Meanwhile, Irene sat perfectly poised in the centre of this aromatic hurricane like a serene, slightly glowing deity. Chroniclers describe her as radiant, spiritually elevated, and calm beyond earthly worry. Yes, that's what happens when you spend your days marinating in incense capable of numbing half the nervous system. She probably handled political stress the same way a spa client handles hot stones, with quiet resignation and mild hallucination. Her private chapel was even more intense. Irene loved long devotional sessions, which involved chanting monks, candlelight, and incense burners that didn't just waft. They erupted fumes like volcanoes specially designed to bless you. Priests swung censers in wide arcs, filling the room until theology became a full-body experience. One monk wrote that Irene's prayers were accompanied by visions. Based on how much resin they were burning, those visions could have included angels, saints, or possibly a talking mosaic on the wall. Whatever she saw, it must have been inspiring, because Irene made some bold political decisions afterward, including blinding her own son to secure power. Let's just say, incense alone cannot be blamed, but it certainly didn't hurt her sense of dramatic timing. Her bath rituals were equally aromatic. Heated rooms infused with medicinal herbs created a steam so potent that attendants sometimes needed breaks to avoid walking sideways afterward. So yes, Empress Irene ruled an empire with cunning, faith, and unwavering imperial authority. She also ruled from inside a cloud of incense, strong enough to make a basilica levitate. Few medieval rulers achieved the tragic, chaotic, medically induced reputation of King Charles VI of France, also known by the extremely subtle nickname Charles the Mad. But here's the twist. Much of his infamous instability came not just from illness, but from the heroic quantities of medicinal substances his court physicians kept pouring into him, like medieval bartenders who skipped the part about moderation. Charles began his reign relatively stable, intelligent, charming, capable. Then he experienced a sudden mental breakdown while marching with his army. One moment he was planning strategy, the next he was attacking his own knights because he believed they were imposters sent to kill him. Medieval burnout was no joke. Naturally, his doctors responded with their favourite solution. "Your Majesty, you need more herbs." And when medieval physicians said herbs, they did not mean chamomile. Charles was given nightshade microdoses, which is already a red flag. No dosage of nightshade should be called micro in the 1300s. Henbane elixirs, believed to calm storms of the mind, though they also caused mild paralysis and visionary episodes. Poppy syrups, consumed as casually as tea. Cannabis resins, burned in his chambers during episodes of agitation. Myrrh and resin vapours, because if it worked for priests, maybe it would work for France's most stressed-out king. the intentions were noble. The results were mixed. Imagine Charles pacing through the palace, mid-episode, convinced he was made of glass. Yes, he sincerely believed this. While attendants tiptoed around him carrying bowls of steaming herbal mixtures strong enough to stupefy a choir boy. There was even a rule in the palace. No one was allowed to touch him suddenly, because he feared he would shatter. His servants walked around him like he was a very anxious chandelier. Now combine this fragile mental state with continuous doses of medieval sedatives that would make modern psychiatrists faint, and you have a king who drifted through reality like a balloon someone forgot to tie down. And yet, Charles had lucid periods. During those rare windows, he expressed heartbreaking awareness of his condition. But the moment he showed distress, his doctors hurried forward with yet another potion that promised clarity and delivered something closer to, "Please lie down before you fall down." His illness was real. His suffering was immense. But the treatments often made things worse. By the end of his life, Charles VI wasn't ruling France so much as floating through it, caught between madness, medicine, and a kingdom praying he wouldn't wander off barefoot into the courtyard again. And that closes our list. A king who lived in a haze not entirely of his own making. Arminius' life began far from marble villas and marching legions. He was born among the Cherusci, a forest people whose world was made of rivers, oak groves, and warriors who believed that freedom was sacred enough to die for. But Rome, as always, had different ideas. In the late 1st century before the Common Era, the empire was expanding into Germania, and peace often came with a contract signed in blood. Tribal princes were taken to Rome as hostages, not prisoners in chains. No, the Romans were far more elegant with their control. These children were insurance policies, raised in the capital to ensure their tribes behaved. Arminius was one of them. Imagine being 8 years old and led away from your homeland, watching your mother vanish behind the tree line as Roman cavalry escorted you south. You're not shackled, but you understand perfectly well that you're not going home anytime soon. To the Romans, this wasn't cruelty, but strategy. If the boy grew up Roman in taste, loyalty, and ambition, he would return as a collaborator. A German body, but a Roman mind. In Rome, Arminius learned Latin, philosophy, warfare, and the subtle art of being useful to an empire that considered his people uncivilized. He dined with aristocrats, studied under generals, and observed how power was created, commanded, and enforced. He wasn't treated like a barbarian. Ironically, he was treated too well. Rome made sure its hostages were comfortable, educated, and flattered, because comfort is the softest kind of chain. Still, even as he absorbed Roman tactics and etiquette, the contrast must have gnawed at him. Here he was, a young noble of the Cherusci, listening to Roman instructors mock the tribes of Germania as primitive brutes, the same tribes who had sent their children as hostages to avoid annihilation. The same tribes who still whispered Arminius's name at winter feasts, unsure if he was even alive. By the time he reached adulthood, Arminius was no longer simply a German prince. Rome had crafted him into a knight of the equestrian order, a trained commander, loyal, in theory, to the emperor, fluent in Latin, disciplined in Roman military doctrine, and fully aware of how legions lived, marched, and died. Rome believed it had shaped him. Rome believed it had tamed him. What it had actually done was far more dangerous. It had taught Arminius exactly how to destroy it. When Arminius reached adulthood, Rome considered him one of its own, or at least close enough to pass in uniform. The boy taken from the forests of Germania had become a polished officer of the Roman auxiliary forces, a knight in the equestrian order, and exactly the kind of foreign-born commander Rome loved to parade as proof of its civilizing mission. Arminius wore the Roman cloak, carried the Roman sword, and rode beside generals who assumed he admired everything the empire represented. And to be fair, Rome had given him power. Real power. As a commander of auxiliary cavalry, Arminius fought in campaigns along the Danube, putting down rebellions and testing his skill against enemies who did not yet know his name. He learned how legions deployed across open fields, how Roman engineers fortified camps overnight, how officers relayed orders, and, perhaps most important, how overconfident Roman commanders became when facing people they considered inferior. Every victory Rome gained taught Arminius something. Every battle honed his instincts. He even earned citizenship and the coveted equestrian rank from Emperor Augustus himself, a badge of honor Romans would have killed for. From the outside, Arminius looked like the poster child for assimilation, a barbarian turned Roman, a success story of imperial ideology. He could sit in Roman banquets, quote Roman poets, and still command soldiers without anyone questioning his loyalty. But Rome had made one miscalculation. They thought Arminius had forgotten where he came from. During his service, he heard whispers from the northern frontier, news of Rome tightening its grip on Germania, tribes being humiliated by corrupt governors, and lands being carved into provinces before anyone asked the locals. Rome didn't see the tribes as allies. It saw them as unclaimed property. Taxation, forced disarmament, and puppet chiefdoms followed. To Augustus, Germania was another prize waiting to be absorbed. To Arminius, it was still home. And so the double life began. By day, he rode with Roman officers, smiling, pretending loyalty. By night, he weighed everything Rome had taught him, not as lessons to serve the empire, but as tools to break it. The irony was almost poetic. Rome's training had not Romanized Arminius. It had weaponized him. He was now a soldier who understood both worlds, the discipline of Rome and the fury of Germania. And soon, Rome would learn that this was the deadliest combination imaginable. When Arminius finally returned to Germania, he did not come as a wandering exile, but as a decorated Roman officer, the kind of man governors welcomed with open arms, expecting loyalty and obedience. Yet the moment his boots touched the forest soil of his homeland, he felt the divide between Rome's polished marble and the raw earth of the tribes. Germania was not a land that bowed easily. The rivers flowed the same. The oak groves whispered as they always had. But beneath the familiar landscape there was tension, sharp enough to taste. Rome had promised alliance. What the tribes received was occupation. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor, saw his position not as stewardship but as domination. He imposed taxes, an alien concept to tribes who believed wealth was measured in honor, not coin, and he enforced Roman law with an arrogance that outpaced his understanding of local customs. Courts, punishments, and demands for tribute spread like a rash, irritating every chieftain from the Weser to the Rhine. Rome might have believed it was bringing order, but to the Germans it felt like a slow suffocation. Arminius saw it immediately. The chiefs who greeted him did so with pride, but also quiet desperation. These were men who had once stood tall beside his father, yet now they whispered their complaints in shadows, fearful of Roman spies. They asked Arminius what he had seen in the capital. Was Rome truly unstoppable? Was resistance hopeless? His answers were careful, measured, never revealing the fire already building inside him. Varus, blind and complacent, admired Arminius. Here was a German who spoke perfect Latin, who had fought Rome's battles, who understood Roman discipline. In Varus's mind, Arminius was an asset, a bridge between cultures, someone who could help pacify the region. He had no idea that Arminius was studying him, not with loyalty, but with calculation, because Arminius knew what the Germans could not yet admit. Rome did not negotiate. Rome absorbed. Today it was taxes and courts. Tomorrow it would be disarmament, labour conscription, and hostages taken generation after generation. His people were on borrowed time. Germany needed a leader, not a diplomat, not a negotiator, a strategist. Someone who understood Rome from the inside. And Arminius realized, with a clarity that reshaped the course of history, that he was the only man who could fill that role. Rome had returned him to his homeland, They had no idea he came carrying their doom. Arminius understood that revolutions don't start with shouting. They start with listening, quietly, patiently, until every complaint, every insult, every wound inflicted by the occupying force reveals a pattern. So he travelled from tribe to tribe, attending councils, drinking at feasts, and sitting beside chieftains who had grown bitter under Roman rule. Some had sons conscripted into auxiliary forces. Others had lost land to Roman administrators. A few simply hated the idea of answering to men who wore skirts made of metal plates. But all shared one truth. The tribes of Germania had never been more united in their anger. The problem was fear. Rome looked invincible. 3 legions guarded the region, disciplined, armoured, and led by Varus, a governor who may have been incompetent but still commanded overwhelming military force. The tribes had fallen before Rome before. Why should this time be different? Arminius had the answer, because unlike any Germanic leader before him, he knew Rome's weaknesses. He knew how legions marched, how they reacted under pressure, how supply lines could be disrupted, how commanders trusted maps more than instincts. And most importantly, he knew how overconfidence could blind even the most seasoned Roman officer. He began to whisper the unthinkable. Rome could be defeated. Not in open battle. That would be suicide. But in the forests, where the trees closed in and cavalry became useless. In the mud, where heavy armour turned soldiers into stumbling statues. In narrow passes, where legions could not deploy into their perfect formations. Germania was not just home, it was a weapon. But a rebellion required unity, and unity required trust. So Arminius met secretly with leaders like Segimer, his father, Malavendus of the Marsi, and chiefs from the Bructeri and the Chatti. They formed the skeleton of a coalition that Varus never suspected existed. At councils lit by firelight, warriors leaned forward as Arminius outlined a plan bold enough to feel like madness. Lure Varus deep into unfamiliar territory during a staged uprising, then destroy the Roman army piece by piece. Some chiefs hesitated. Betraying Rome was one thing. Executing a coordinated attack on 3 legions was another. But Arminius's confidence was contagious. His knowledge was precise. His conviction was unmistakable. And slowly, resistance transformed into resolve. By summer's end, the trap was ready. The only thing left was to bait Varus, a task that Arminius knew would be almost too easy. After all, nothing is simpler than deceiving a man who already believes he cannot be fooled. Arminius had spent enough time around Roman governors to know one universal truth. The more incompetent the official, the more convinced he was of his own genius. Publius Quinctilius Varus was the living embodiment of this rule. Augustus had sent him to govern Germania as though he were relocating a tax accountant to a distant office. Varus expected paperwork, not warfare. He believed the Germans merely needed a firm Roman hand, preferably his own, to civilize them. And because arrogance rarely travels alone, he also believed Arminius was his loyal ally. This was the weakness Arminius intended to exploit. He began feeding Varus carefully crafted lies, that a rebellion had erupted in a remote region, that certain tribes were restless, that Roman authority was being questioned. Nothing dramatic, just enough to poke at Varus's pride. Varus had spent months forcing Roman law upon people who didn't want it. The idea that anyone dared resist him was intolerable. Arminius played him like a man tuning a harp, plucking each string until Varus convinced himself the situation required his personal intervention. The brilliance of the deception lay in its subtlety. Arminius never pushed too hard. He never raised his voice. He simply reported concerns, offered to guide the legions, and assured Varus he had everything under control. In doing so, he reinforced the governor's favourite story, that Rome had successfully Romanized a German prince who was eager to prove his loyalty. Varus swallowed it completely. As summer waned, Arminius suggested that the legions march into the Teutoburg region to deal with the supposed uprising. Varus, confident in his authority and even more confident in Arminius, agreed without hesitation. He gathered 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliaries, camp followers, merchants, and wagons. It was not a rapid strike force. It was a lumbering parade of men who believed the forests were nothing more than background scenery. But a few Roman officers were not so easily fooled. Segestes, a Germanic noble who distrusted Arminius, warned Varus bluntly, "Do not trust this man. He plots against you." But Varus dismissed the warning. Why? Because Varus trusted paperwork, ranks, and Roman titles, and Arminius possessed all of them. When the march began, Arminius rode at Varus's side, face calm, voice loyal, heart burning. He told Varus the path was safe. He told Varus the tribes needed Roman guidance. He told Varus exactly what the governor wanted to hear. And behind the polite smiles, the greatest ambush in Roman history was already unfolding. The march began under a sky that promised rain. Not an unusual omen in Germania, but one the Romans should have taken more seriously. The Teutoburg forest was dense, old, and deeply unfriendly to travellers who relied on straight roads and wide formations. Rome had built its empire on open terrain, where legions could spread their wings and let discipline do the killing. But in Germania, the trees closed in like walls, the ground turned to sucking mud, and visibility shrank until the world became a narrow corridor of dripping leaves. Varus, oblivious, pressed forward. He brought with him not just soldiers, but entire civilian entourages, cooks, smiths, merchants, servants, and animals. This wasn't an army on high alert. It was a mobile administration office. The column stretched for miles, winding through forest paths like a silver snake strangled by vines. And at the head of this unwieldy procession rode Arminius, offering guidance like the perfect ally. Then, at precisely the moment he needed to vanish, Arminius requested permission to gather allied Germanic troops to help subdue the fake rebellion he himself had invented. Varus, convinced of his loyalty, let him go. It was the last decision he made that wasn't soaked in regret. As Arminius disappeared into the trees, the weather turned. Sheets of rain hammered the canopy. Wind howled through the branches. The muddy ground transformed into a swamp disguised as a road. Roman shields grew slick, their sandals lost grip. Wagons overturned in ditches. Cohesion fell apart as soldiers tried to keep formation in terrain that punished every step. The Germans could not have asked for a better stage. Hidden behind branches, trenches, and natural ridges, warriors from multiple tribes waited. Men Arminius had personally rallied over months of secret meetings. Their bodies were painted, their weapons ready, and their fury sharpened by years of humiliation under Roman rule. They watched quietly, letting the Romans sink deeper into the forest, deeper into vulnerability, deeper into the trap from which there would be no escape. Varus still believed he was marching toward a minor revolt. He had no idea the revolt was behind him, above him, and surrounding him on every side. And somewhere in the dripping green labyrinth, Arminius raised his arm, the signal he had waited years to give. The forest held its breath. The Romans marched blindly, and Germania prepared to strike. The first attack did not come as a grand clash of armies. It came as a scream, sharp, inhuman, echoing through the dripping branches. A moment later, a volley of spears erupted from the tree line, tearing into the Roman column. Men collapsed before they even understood what was happening. The forest exploded with war cries, the kind that bypass logic and punch directly into the spine. Germania had been waiting decades for this moment, and it came like a storm breaking free of its chains. The Romans, trained for open-field combat, scrambled to form ranks, but the terrain betrayed them. Centurions shouted for order, but their voices drowned beneath the shrieking wind and the pounding rain. Shields were useless against javelins thrown from above. Swords were too short to reach foes who struck and vanished into the woods. The forest was not a battlefield. It was an execution chamber. Arminius's warriors struck from all sides, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. A handful rushed forward to attack, then fell back before the legions could respond. Others targeted officers, cutting off command before it could stabilize the line. Everywhere Varus looked, the trees themselves seemed alive with movement. Shadows flickering, blades flashing, enemies attacking and vanishing like ghosts. Wagons overturned, blocking the narrow path. Horses panicked, trampling soldiers. Supply mules broke free and scattered into the forest. And as confusion spread, the rain intensified, turning the ground into a sucking mire that pinned Roman sandals like traps. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, dissolved into clumps of terrified men fighting in isolation. Varus attempted to regroup, calling for a fortified camp. But building defences in the midst of chaos proved nearly impossible. And while the Romans dug trenches and erected makeshift walls from shields and debris, Germanic warriors continued their harassment, raining spears into the half-built camp until nightfall. When darkness came, it offered no relief. The Romans huddled together, soaked, trembling, listening to the taunting shouts from the forest. Germania had not just attacked, it was savouring the moment. Warriors sang victory songs, drums echoed like thunder. To the Romans it sounded like the forest itself was celebrating their doom. Varus tried to maintain the illusion of control, but even he saw the truth. They were not fighting an enemy. They were being hunted. And Arminius, the man he trusted, was the hunter leading them into the abyss. By dawn, the Romans were no longer marching. They were fleeing in slow motion. Exhaustion clung to them like wet cloth. The makeshift camp they abandoned behind them looked less like a military fortification and more like the remnants of a disaster site. Varus tried to restore order, but his voice had lost its authority. Men looked at him not as a general, but as a man who had led them into a nightmare and had no idea how to lead them out. Arminius, meanwhile, had returned to his warriors, no longer hiding his allegiance. His calm Roman exterior was gone, replaced by a Germanic war leader whose knowledge of Roman tactics now guided the destruction of 3 entire legions. He divided his forces into flexible bands, each assigned to choke points along the Romans' escape route. Every ravine, every slope, every bend in the forest had been chosen in advance. Germania itself had become a trap, designed by someone who knew exactly how Roman formations needed to move, and how to stop them from moving at all. As the Romans attempted to advance, the path narrowed into a ridge flanked by steep drops. It was here that the next wave crashed down. Germanic warriors rolled boulders and felled trees, crushing ranks and sealing off retreat. Javelins rained down again, but this time the Romans were too tightly packed to maneuver their shields. Screams ricocheted through the chaos as soldiers toppled into the ravines, slipping in mud slicked with blood. Varus ordered the legions to break out, but his commands dissolved into panic. The 17th fell into disarray first. Its eagle standard, the soul of the legion, was lost in the melee. When a Roman legion lost its eagle, it usually meant annihilation. Here, it was simply the first omen. The 18th suffered next, collapsing under relentless assaults from above. Entire cohorts were pinned against the slope, unable to climb, unable to fight, unable to escape. The Germans attacked with ferocity sharpened by years of humiliation, each blow a rejection of Roman domination. As for the 19th, it was surrounded, cut off, and slowly strangled by successive ambushes. A legion trained to fight in open fields now died in fragments, scattered through dripping forests that turned every tree into a spear, every shadow into a killer. Varus realized he had lost not just the battle, but the Empire's illusion of invincibility. Somewhere amid the wreckage of men and armour, one truth settled over the survivors like a burial shroud. This was no revolt. This was retribution. By the 3rd day, the Teutoburg forest had become a graveyard. The Romans were not simply defeated, they were erased. 3 legions that had once been the pride of the Empire no longer existed. Their eagle standards were lost to the mud and the trees. Their officers lay scattered among broken equipment, crushed wagons, and corpses half buried in swampy soil. And somewhere in the chaos, Varus, recognizing the magnitude of his failure, fell on his own sword, choosing death over the humiliation of capture. When word reached Rome, Emperor Augustus reportedly tore his robes, shouting, "Quinctilius Verus, give me back my legions." But there were no legions to give back. Arminius had not won a battle. He had torn a hole in Roman history that would never fully close. For the Germans, the victory was earth-shaking. Tribes that had once squabbled over pasture land suddenly stood united in triumph. Arminius was hailed as a liberator, a man who had done what no one believed possible: humiliate the greatest military power in the known world. The forest where the ambush took place became sacred ground, proof that cunning and courage could triumph over imperial arrogance. And yet victory carried its own burdens. Arminius was no longer simply a military commander. He was a symbol, and symbols attract rivals. Some chieftains feared he aimed to make himself a king, the very thing Germans traditionally despised. His uncle Segestes, long hostile toward him, denounced him repeatedly to Rome and encouraged internal opposition. Political fractures began to reopen. Tribal leaders who had united against Varus now returned to their old grudges, their temporary alliance dissolving under the weight of personal ambition. Rome, though wounded, was not broken. Germanicus, famed general and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, launched multiple campaigns to avenge the Teutoburg disaster. He defeated Arminius in several open battles, recovered some of the lost eagle standards, and proved that Rome still had teeth. But even Germanicus could not fully conquer Germania. The land was too wild, and the tribes too scattered. Arminius survived Rome's reprisals, but not his own people. His power frightened rival nobles, who saw in him the shadow of monarchy. In 21 CE they assassinated him, a liberator slain not by invaders, but by the very leaders he fought to free. Arminius died at 37, but his legacy endured. The man who stopped Rome and ensured Germania would never be a Roman province. When Qin Shi Huang finally unified the warring states in 221 BCE, he was not content with merely ending centuries of bloodshed. He wanted to remake China itself, its laws, its infrastructure, its identity, and its borders. And he wanted those borders to stay quiet. The northern frontier, however, had no interest in cooperating. Beyond the cultivated fields and newly conquered towns lay the steppes, home to the Xiongnu, horsemen who rode like the wind, raiders who appeared and vanished before infantry could form ranks, and enemies who refused to recognize the concept of a fixed frontier. For generations, these northern nomads had harassed the states of Zhao, Yan, and Qin. Their cavalry could cross vast distances in a day, burning settlements and seizing livestock. Now that the first emperor ruled a united land, he had no patience for an enemy that didn't respect walls, or the men who built them. His solution was ambitious, brutal, and terrifying in scale. He ordered the linking and reinforcement of the old border fortifications built by the defeated states. What once were scattered defensive lines would become a single, continuous barrier stretching across mountains, deserts, and wilderness. The idea wasn't entirely new. The states of Qin, Zhao, and Yan had already experimented with walls centuries earlier. But Qin Shi Huang envisioned something far greater, a spine of stone, earth, and wood that would mark the northern limit of civilization and keep the barbarians out. It wasn't simply a military project. It was a symbol, a declaration of permanence from a ruler obsessed with making his rule eternal. But even grand visions come with a cost, and the emperor had a unique solution to labor shortages. He would use the people who had displeased him. Tens of thousands of conscripted peasants, soldiers, debtors, and prisoners were dispatched to the frontier. Many had been punished for criticizing imperial reforms, failing to pay taxes, or even being related to someone who offended an official. Now they marched north in chains, not knowing whether they would build a wall, freeze on a mountainside, or simply vanish. Qin Shi Huang's architects assured him it could be done. His generals assured him it would be worthwhile. His officials assured him the people would obey. And so the project began. A colossal undertaking meant to secure an empire, define a civilization, and leave behind a monument that would outlive every man who touched it. A monument that would become, for many, not a wall, but a tomb. The order to build the wall spread through the newly unified empire like a winter wind, cold, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Imperial officials appeared in villages with wooden tablets listing names, quotas, and penalties. Men between 15 and 50 were expected to serve. Farmers were taken from their fields, artisans from their workshops, and soldiers from their barracks. Some went willingly, believing the emperor's promise of strengthened borders. Most went because refusal meant death. Qin law was famously unforgiving, and the wall was built on that unforgiving foundation. For many families, the moment of conscription felt like a funeral. Mothers watched their sons depart, knowing the northern frontier was a place where even seasoned soldiers feared to tread. Wives stood silently as husbands were marched away in chains, uncertain whether they would ever return. The emperor's decree did not distinguish between the innocent and the unlucky. Even those accused of minor infractions, late taxes, unregistered tools, disrespect toward local officials, found themselves branded labourers and shipped to the harshest work sites in the realm. Convoys of prisoners, peasants, and soldiers stretched across the roads of Qin, thousands walking in rigid formation as overseers barked orders. They carried little more than basic tools: wicker baskets for earth, crude chisels for rock, and wooden poles for scaffolding. Once they reached the frontier, there were no inns, no warm shelters, no tidy barracks waiting. Instead, they found jagged mountainsides, barren deserts, and an expanse of wind so fierce it seemed determined to tear flesh from bone. Work began before dawn and continued until the stars returned. Overseers enforced discipline with whips and rods. Food was meagre, often nothing more than millet gruel, while water had to be hauled from distant streams or melted from snow. Labourers who collapsed were given moments to recover, but only moments. The emperor demanded speed, and speed demanded sacrifices. And yet, amid the cruelty, there was a strange unity. Soldiers who once served rival kingdoms now hauled stones side by side. Criminals laboured next to peasants who had never broken a law in their lives. Under Qin rule, everyone was equal in one respect. No one was allowed to stop working. As the first foundations took shape, the labourers realised something that chilled them more than the northern winds. This was not a temporary project. This was their life now, for months, years, or however long their bodies survived. The wall was rising, and its builders were disappearing into it. The northern frontier was nothing like the fertile heartland the labourers had left behind. There were no familiar terraces of rice, no gentle rivers winding through valleys. The Great Wall was to be built where nature itself resisted human presence. In the west, the land dissolved into the dry breath of the Gobi Desert, where dunes shifted like living beasts and swallowed roads overnight. Farther east rose the Yin Mountains, jagged ranges that tore at the sky and forced men to cling to rocks like insects. Everywhere else lay unforgiving plains patrolled by Xiongnu scouts, who watched the construction from a distance with cold curiosity. For the labourers, the frontier felt like exile. Winters arrived early, smothering the ground in snow that never fully thawed. Winds screamed across the landscape, bringing sand that scoured faces raw and ice that cracked wooden scaffolding. Some days, men worked wrapped in layers of woven grass just to keep their skin from freezing. Other days, they laboured shirtless under blistering summer heat, their sweat evaporating faster than it formed. Shelter was a luxury they rarely enjoyed. Camps were little more than fabric tents, weighed down with stones or caves carved hastily into cliffs. Fires were small and precious, fueled by the few shrubs or branches the land grudgingly offered. At night, the howl of wolves blended with the groans of exhausted men, a chorus of suffering that echoed across valleys. Those who died during the walk north were left beside the roadside. Those who died during construction were often buried beneath the nearest mound of earth, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without even pausing the day's work. Yet, the danger wasn't only nature. The Xiongnu lurked like shadows on horseback, watching the progress of their enemy's new barrier. They launched sudden raids on supply convoys, cut down stragglers, and sometimes circled the work sites just close enough to taunt the workers with shouts and arrows. Work would halt only long enough for Qin soldiers to chase the attackers off, and then the overseers would force the exhausted labourers back into their lines. But the harshness of the frontier served the emperor's purpose. Here, no one could escape. Here men disappeared without a trace, their names fading into the wind. And here, in this crucible of ice, sand and stone, the first true segments of the Qin wall began to rise, a monument to power, built in a place where human endurance was stretched to its breaking point. The Qin Empire did not possess modern cranes, iron machines, or mathematical surveying tools for large-scale construction. What it had instead were human bodies, thousands upon thousands of them, and a ruler whose will was unyielding. The methods for building the wall varied depending on the terrain, but they all shared one truth. Every metre required immense, back-breaking labour. In the deserts and plains, the builders used a technique called rammed earth, layering soil, gravel, and clay between wooden frames. Teams of men beat the mixture with heavy wooden rammers, their rhythmic thudding echoing across the landscape like the heartbeat of a great beast. This method produced walls dense enough to resist the weather and tall enough to intimidate raiders. But the work was punishing. Shoulders dislocated, palms blistered open, and men collapsed in the dust from dehydration. In the mountains, the task grew even more brutal. Workers carved paths into cliffsides, hauling stones up steep slopes that seemed determined to throw them back down. Ropes snapped. Scaffolding collapsed. Slabs of granite slid like avalanches, crushing those unfortunate enough to stand in their path. To the overseers, these deaths were simply part of the cost. "Replace them," they ordered, waving forward the next line of trembling labourers. Carts drawn by oxen carried materials across treacherous terrain, but often the paths became too narrow, too steep, or too muddy. When animals could go no farther, men replaced them, pulling, pushing, dragging loads with ropes dug into their shoulders until their skin tore. Every sound in the air was a blend of grunts, shouted orders, cracking whips, and the relentless pounding of rammers. Despite the suffering, the wall grew steadily. Watchtowers rose above the landscape, providing beacons from which soldiers could scan the horizon for the dust trails of Xiongnu riders. Trenches were dug. Barracks were built. The wall began stitching itself across the frontier like a scar, marking the border between the civilized world and the wild. But for the men who built it, the wall was not a marvel of engineering. It was a chain, and every stone, every handful of earth, every timber hammered into place carried the memory of someone who had fallen along the way. The emperor saw progress. The overseers saw discipline. The workers saw only one truth. This wall demanded more than labour. It demanded lives. As the wall stretched farther across the frontier, the cost in human life became impossible to hide. Though the Qin state did not bother trying. Death was an expected expense. Officials recorded supplies, tools, and measurements with meticulous precision, but they rarely recorded the dead. A man who collapsed from exhaustion was replaced before his body cooled. A man buried in a landslide became part of the earthwork. Illness spread through the camps with terrifying speed: dysentery, fever, frostbite, and infections from untreated wounds. For many labourers, survival became less likely than death. Food shortages were constant. The frontier could not sustain large populations, and the empire struggled to transport enough grain across long distances. When supplies ran low, soldiers ate first, overseers ate second, the workers ate last, if anything remained. Some labourers boiled grass into a bitter soup. Others chewed on leather straps to trick their bodies into thinking they were fed. Men weakened quickly, and the weaker they grew, the more likely they were to become casualties of the next day's labour. Punishments were brutal and public. A man who slowed down the workforce could be tied to a post and whipped until he could stand again, or until he could not. Those accused of sabotage, disobedience, or escape attempts faced execution on the spot. Their bodies were sometimes buried under the wall itself, not out of ceremony but convenience. Whether this was truly entombment in the wall or simply careless burial, the effect was the same. The wall became a grave for countless unnamed souls. Despite the harshness, rumours spread among the workers. Some believed that the emperor intended the wall to last forever, not just as a military defence, but as a monument to his reign. Others whispered that Qin Shi Huang was terrified of death and sought permanence in structures that could outlive him. To the builders, these whispers only deepened their resentment. They suffered not for a cause, not for protection, but for the ambition of one man. Yet even in despair, moments of humanity flickered. Workers shared their remaining food. Old veterans taught younger men how to wrap cloth to protect their shoulders. At night, men sang songs of their homes, reminding one another that they had lived real lives before becoming faceless labourers in the emperor's machine. Still, the truth remained. The wall was growing, and men were dying faster than the empire could replace them. Each new section completed stood as both a triumph of engineering and a testament to the vanished thousands who had fallen beneath it. The wall rose higher, and the shadow of the emperor grew longer. While the labourers bore the weight of the wall's construction, the soldiers stationed along the frontier paid their own steep price. They were not simply guards, they were symbols of Qin authority, extensions of the emperor's will. Yet even their rigid discipline could not mask the reality that this was one of the harshest postings in the empire. Many had once marched triumphantly in Qin's wars of unification. Now they found themselves stationed atop windswept ridges, staring into a horizon that promised only danger. Their duty was relentless. Every watchtower required round-the-clock surveillance, especially at night when the Xiongnu were most likely to strike. Soldiers huddled around small fires, gripping their spears, listening to the distant snorts of unseen horses. The northern winds gnawed at them just as mercilessly as they did the workers. Armour offered little warmth. Cloaks froze stiff. In winter, even drawing breath felt like inhaling knives. Though soldiers received better rations than labourers, shortages struck them too. Supplies struggled to cross mountains where snow blocked passes, and convoys risked ambush. When grain failed to arrive, soldiers went hungry alongside the men they guarded. And unlike the labourers, who could collapse without consequence, soldiers were expected to endure. Weakness in a guard post could doom an entire stretch of the frontier. Tensions grew between the two groups. Soldiers enforced order with strict authority, driving workers to continue even when exhaustion made their hands shake. Yet many soldiers quietly sympathised with the labourers, recognising the same fear in their eyes. Fear of a landscape that killed as ruthlessly as any enemy. Some secretly shared food or water, small gestures that risked severe punishment if discovered. And then there were the battles. While the wall was under construction, Xiongnu raiders launched sudden attacks to disrupt progress. They targeted isolated camps, supply caravans, and partly completed fortifications. Soldiers sprinted across ridges to repel these assaults, often fighting outnumbered, their feet slipping on loose earth or icy stone. Many fell from cliffs or were struck down before reinforcements could arrive. When the fighting ended, the soldiers returned to their posts, knowing that their victories were temporary and their losses permanent. The wall may have been built for defence, but during its construction it felt more like a provocation, a reminder to the Xiongnu that Qin intended to claim the frontier. And the soldiers stationed there understood a painful truth. They were defending a project that was still incomplete, still vulnerable, and still costing lives every single day. Even the army, the pride of Qin, could feel the emperor's ambition pressing down like a weight they too might never be able to escape. As months turned into years, the construction of the Qin wall became a rhythm that consumed the frontier. Every day began the same way. A whistle from an overseer, the clatter of tools being lifted, and thousands of feet trudging to the next unfinished stretch. Progress wasn't measured in miles, but in misery. How many men survived the day? How many collapses could be repaired? How many new sections could be forced into existence before darkness returned? The wall did not grow in a straight, elegant line. It twisted along ridges, followed the contours of mountains, and dipped into valleys where the earth was soft enough to mould. Different regions produced different styles: packed earth in the west, stone layers in the northern mountains, timber fortifications in forested areas. This patchwork reflected the frantic pace of Qin expansion. Build whatever you can, as long as it stands tall and stands now. For the labourers, the wall's progression felt surreal. One morning they would wake to an empty ridge, barren except for scattered rocks. By nightfall, that same ridge would be crowned with a rampart, crude but imposing, the product of thousands of hands breaking, hauling, pounding, and shaping the landscape. Workers often stared at the newly raised segments with a numb mixture of awe and despair. They were building a monument larger than themselves, yet they had no claim to it. Their names would never be recorded. Their families would never know where they died. Still, the work never stopped. In rainy seasons, mud turned to glue, sucking off shoes and trapping carts until teams of men dragged them free. In dry seasons, dust storms swallowed entire work sites, forcing labourers to cover their faces with scraps of cloth while continuing to hammer earth into place by feel alone. Thunderstorms shattered scaffolds. Earthquakes collapsed portions that had taken months to construct. Each disaster meant repeating the same grueling tasks with even fewer survivors remaining. The Empire kept sending more men, fresh criminals, newly conscripted peasants, political offenders. Some arrived defiant, others terrified, but all eventually succumbed to the same exhaustion. They were absorbed into the machine, into the slow and relentless march of expansion. A man had no past on the frontier. He had only the wall in front of him and the overseer behind. As the wall stretched farther, labourers whispered a bitter phrase: "The wall grows, the empire grows, but we grow fewer." Yet the project persisted, driven by a single truth. Qin Shi Huang demanded a barrier that would reshape the world, and the world, unwillingly, was being reshaped stone by stone, life by life. As the wall crept across the frontier like a giant scar, its purpose expanded far beyond defence. Qin Shi Huang did not merely want to keep invaders out, he wanted to keep his empire in. The wall became a visible reminder of his authority, stretching farther than any messenger could travel in a day, a physical declaration that the emperor's reach extended into the most remote and desolate corners of the world. It was as if he carved his name into the landscape itself, demanding that all who looked upon it remember who commanded heaven and earth. For many in the empire, the wall became a symbol of dread rather than pride. Stories circulated about men who were dragged from their homes simply for criticizing imperial reforms, sentenced to labor on the frontier until their bones gave out. Families whispered warnings to their children: "Obey the law, or the wall will take you." The very mention of the northern work sites could silence a crowd. It was widely believed that those who vanished into the construction camps were rarely seen again, and the truth was not far from the rumours. Officials, too, used the wall as political leverage. A rival bureaucrat could be accidentally assigned to oversee a remote section, a subtle death sentence disguised as promotion. Even nobles feared offending the wrong minister. The wall was an equalizer in the most brutal sense, stripping away wealth, rank, and privilege. On the frontier, everyone answered to the emperor alone, yet Qin propaganda spun a different tale. Court poets and scholars praised the wall as a dragon of protection, a sacred shield guarding the realm from chaos. Travel records described it as the greatest engineering achievement in history. Statues and inscriptions celebrated the emperor's benevolence in securing peace for future generations. But those who actually worked on the wall knew the truth. It was built with more cruelty than stone. Still, the wall did its job. The Xiongnu, unnerved by the rapid expansion, retreated farther north, uncertain how to confront a barrier that grew faster than they could tear it down. Patrols reported fewer raids. Farmers along the inner frontier began to sleep with a little less fear. The emperor's vision, for all its brutality, was shaping the geopolitical landscape. But beneath this veneer of stability, resentment simmered. Every clenched fist, every unmarked grave, every family mourning sons lost to the frontier carried a quiet, dangerous question. How long can an empire stand if it is mortared with suffering? The wall rose higher, the emperor's power grew heavier, and the foundations of rebellion were quietly setting. By the time Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, the wall stretched across thousands of li, from the deserts of the west to the rugged mountains of the east. It was not a single, continuous structure like later dynasties would refine, but it was vast enough to intimidate enemies and awe travellers. More importantly, it had reshaped the identity of the empire. The Qin Wall was both a grand achievement and an open wound, one that pulsed with stories of suffering whispered across generations. After the emperor's death, the state he built unravelled with brutal speed. His successors proved incapable of holding together the lands he had unified, and rebellion erupted across the empire. The harsh laws he imposed, the taxes he demanded, and the relentless construction projects he forced on the population had poisoned public sentiment. The wall, once portrayed as a protective dragon, was now remembered as a monument to oppression. Many veterans of the frontier joined the uprisings, carrying with them scars, both physical and emotional, from their years on the northern ridge. When the Qin dynasty fell and the Han rose in its place, the new rulers inherited the fractured remains of the wall. Instead of abandoning it, they chose to rebuild and expand it, recognizing its strategic value. But unlike the Qin, the Han used diplomacy alongside force, forging alliances with some nomadic groups while reinforcing vulnerable stretches. The wall, once a symbol of the first emperor's obsession, now served a more practical purpose, a managed frontier rather than an impossible barrier. Yet the legacy of the Qin Wall remained unmistakable. In folk tales and songs, it became known as the structure where 10,000 men died, a place where the earth itself held the bones of the forgotten. Archaeologists would later discover graves near ancient sections, confirming what workers had always murmured. The wall consumed lives as readily as it repelled enemies. Even today, stories persist of spirits wandering the old ramparts, echoes of men who never returned home. But despite its grim origins, the wall influenced centuries of Chinese defense strategy and ultimately inspired the far more famous structures we now associate with the Great Wall. Without the Qin, there would be no massive stone ramparts snaking across mountaintops, no watchtowers piercing the sky, no monumental testament to human endurance. In the end, the Qin Wall stands as a paradox, a masterpiece built from misery, a shield forged through suffering, and a reminder that even the greatest monuments come with shadows. The wall survived its makers, but their stories remain buried within it, silent, unmarked, and eternal. Long before the roar of modern crowds or the gleam of international stadiums, the Olympic Games were born in a quiet, fertile valley in the western Peloponnese. Olympia was not a bustling city or a political powerhouse. It was a sanctuary, an ancient grove where the Greeks believed the presence of gods lingered in the rustling leaves. Here, amidst wild olive trees, marble altars, and the scent of burning offerings, the earliest foundations of the Games took shape. The year 776 BCE would later be named the First Olympiad. But the truth was far older. No one can say when the Greeks first gathered to honour Zeus with physical contests. Myths offered competing stories. Some claimed Heracles, fresh from performing his legendary labours, established the Games to thank Zeus for granting him strength. Others insisted that Pelops, a hero whose chariot victory won him a kingdom, founded them to commemorate his divine triumph. Every version shared one theme. The Games began where humans sought to reach toward the divine. Olympia's sacred identity made it the perfect stage. Unlike the warring city-states scattered across Greece, the sanctuary belonged to no single polis. Its temples, treasuries and altars were neutral ground, protected by religious law. Even enemies were expected to behave with reverence upon entering its boundaries. And because the Greeks believed Zeus watched from above, every athlete who entered the arena carried not only the pride of their city, but the weight of divine judgment. But the games were not created merely to entertain. They were offerings, gifts of strength, endurance, and courage presented to the gods. Victories brought honor not just to the athlete, but to Zeus himself. Losing was not shameful. Failing to give one's best effort was. It was said that an athlete must compete for the glory of Zeus alone, a reminder that ambition was allowed, but arrogance was not. As pilgrims gathered from distant lands, Sparta, Corinth, Athens, Elis, they arrived with the same awe one might bring to a sacred pilgrimage. They came bearing sacrifices, prayers, and hopes. Before any race could begin, before any athlete could be crowned, priests lit the sacred fire at the altar of Zeus, its smoke rising into the sky as an invitation to the divine. In that moment, the world of mortals paused. Ritual replaced rivalry. Piety overshadowed politics. And from this sacred space, the Olympic Games emerged, not as sport, but as a holy dialogue between humans and gods. A dialogue that would soon unite all of Greece. To understand the true power of the ancient Olympics, one must first understand Greece in the 8th century BCE, a land of fierce independence, proud rivalries, and constant conflict. City-states like Sparta, Athens, Argos, and Corinth were more than neighbours. They were competitors in politics, trade, and war. Feuds could last generations. Borders shifted with every season. Distrust was the default. And yet, every 4 years, something extraordinary happened. A divine peace known as the Ekacheria, or Sacred Truce, was proclaimed across the Greek world. Heralds travelled from Olympia to the farthest city-states, announcing that during the upcoming games, all warfare must stop. Soldiers were ordered to put down their spears. Generals postponed campaigns. Even bitter enemies agreed, if only temporarily, to honour the will of Zeus. This truce was not a polite suggestion. It was a sacred obligation. Violating it meant offending the king of the gods himself, an act considered reckless at best and suicidal at worst. The Greeks believed that the gods watched over the games with sharp, discerning eyes, ready to punish those who disrespected their festival. The practical effects were astonishing. Roads that were usually dangerous suddenly became safe. Pilgrims could walk hundreds of miles across mountains, past hostile territories, and through strange cities without fear. Athletes, trainers, poets, merchants, and spectators made their way to Olympia in long caravans, united by a purpose greater than politics. For many Greeks, the journey itself was a spiritual transformation. A Spartan might travel beside an Athenian without reaching for a weapon. A Corinthian merchant might share a wineskin with a Theban storyteller by the roadside. These were encounters that never would have occurred in wartime, and in Greece, wartime was most of the time. The sacred truce also signalled the start of ritual preparations in each city. Families chose which athlete would represent them. Noble houses boasted of sons training for glory. Gyms and running tracks filled with hopeful competitors. Even the poorest villagers dreamed of seeing Olympia, perhaps for the first and only time in their lives. As the days passed, excitement spread. When the heralds' voices echoed across the hills, announcing the exact date of the games, Greece shifted into a rare moment of unity. The truce did not erase rivalries, but it elevated something more important: the shared belief that honouring Zeus and celebrating excellence was worth pausing the endless churn of war. In those sacred weeks, Greece remembered what it meant to be one people, and all roads, peaceful at last, led to Olympia. As the sacred truce took effect, the Greek world seemed to inhale deeply and, just for a moment, stop bracing for war. Roads that had once belonged to armies now filled with pilgrims carrying offerings, travellers seeking spectacle, and athletes chasing immortality. For many, the journey to Olympia was as important as the games themselves, a pilgrimage of devotion, endurance, and anticipation. Athletes often travelled months in advance, accompanied by trainers, family members, and supporters. Some came from wealthy city-states and arrived with well-funded entourages. Others came barefoot from remote villages, carrying little more than a bronze strigil and a bag of figs. Yet all walked the same dusty paths, all cooked over the same roadside fires, and all gazed toward the west with the same mixture of nerves and excitement. Along the way, small towns and sanctuaries offered places to rest, pray, and prepare. Inns overflowed. Merchants set up stalls selling oil, salted fish, pottery, and amulets said to bring Zeus's favour. Poets and musicians performed for coins, turning the journey into a moving festival. Even storytellers gathered crowds, recounting the victories of legendary athletes, men who had lifted bulls, outrun horses, or been crowned 3, 4, even 5 times. But the pilgrimage wasn't only festive. It was a test. Athletes were expected to obey strict moral and physical discipline on the road. They trained in the mornings, abstained from excessive food or wine, and slept on hard surfaces to condition their bodies. They avoided impurity, prayed daily, and treated the journey not as a vacation, but as the beginning of the competition. The closer they came to Olympia, the more reverent the atmosphere became. Travellers crossed rivers believed to be sacred, passed shrines to Hermes and Apollo, and walked beneath towering oak trees said to whisper oracles. The landscape itself seemed to prepare them for what awaited. Finally, after long days of marching, the travellers reached the Altes, the sacred grove that housed temples, treasuries, altars, and statues. The scent of burning incense drifted through the air. Priests tended sacred fires, and above all stood the monumental temple of Zeus, its pediments gleaming in the sun, its presence overwhelming even the bravest athlete. For many pilgrims, stepping into Olympia felt like stepping out of the mortal world entirely, a place where gods watched from every shadow, a place where the greatest feats of human ability were expected, not exceptional, a place where legends were born. Long before a single runner set foot on the track or a wrestler squared his stance, the ancient Olympics began with rituals, solemn, magnificent, and deeply rooted in the Greek relationship with the divine. For the Greeks, athletic competition was meaningless unless it honoured the gods, and Zeus, king of Olympus, demanded nothing less than perfection. The day before the games officially opened, the Altes transformed into a vast ceremonial theatre. Thousands gathered around the great altar of Zeus, a towering mound of ash built from centuries of burnt offerings. Priests robed in white moved with measured steps, their voices rising in hymns older than any recorded Olympiad. The air thickened with the scent of olive branches, incense, and freshly slaughtered animals, whose smoke rose in spirals toward the sky. Athletes took part in a sacred oath ceremony at the Bouleuterion, the council hall. Standing before the statue of Zeus Horkios, Zeus of Oaths, they swore to obey the rules of the games, to compete honourably, and to train rigorously for the required 10 months. Breaking the oath invited not only punishment from officials, but divine wrath. In front of Zeus's steely gaze, no man dared lie. Parents and spectators also offered sacrifices: small bronze figurines, coins, olive wreaths, and textiles. These were tokens of gratitude or desperate prayer. A father might sacrifice a goat, hoping his son would return victorious. A pilgrim might bring a simple offering of barley cake, asking only for safe travel home. The value of the gift mattered less than the sincerity behind it. The most dramatic ritual came with the hecatomb, a public sacrifice of 100 cattle to Zeus. As each animal fell, its blood soaked into the sacred earth, symbolizing purification and awe. The choicest meat was burned for the god. The rest would later feed thousands in a massive communal feast. In this shared meal, rivalry softened. Athletes who would soon battle in the stadium sat side by side, tasting the same sacred food. Musicians played flutes. Poets recited hymns celebrating Zeus, heroes, and past Olympic champions. Children ran between the crowds carrying olive leaves from the sacred grove. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the world were pausing for the ritual to settle across the land. Only once the sacrifices were accepted, only once Zeus was honoured, could the games begin. For without the blessing of the Father of Gods, no victory meant anything. And without ritual, the Olympics were not competition. They were sacrilege. With the rituals complete and Zeus duly honoured, the sanctuary of Olympia shifted from a solemn temple ground into the heart of the Greek world's greatest festival. The first official moment of the Games was the opening procession, a spectacle that captured the spirit of unity the Olympics were meant to embody. At dawn, a trumpet blast echoed through the Altes, bouncing off marble columns and rustling the sacred grove. Athletes, judges, officials and heralds gathered at the entrance of the sanctuary, each representing a different city-state, each carrying the pride of their homeland on their shoulders. Despite Greece being a patchwork of independent, and often hostile polis, the procession presented a vision of what unity could look like. Leading the march were the Hellenodikai, the judges of the Games. Selected from the city of Elis, they trained for months to learn the rules, the rituals, and the proper conduct expected of Olympic officials. Dressed in flowing robes, they walked with a solemn dignity, for their authority came not from law, but from Zeus himself. Behind them came the athletes, moving in orderly lines, bodies gleaming with oil, muscles carved by months of laborious training. Some bore the rugged physique of Spartans, hardened by discipline since childhood. Others carried the proud elegance of Athenian competitors, trained in gymnasia filled with philosophers and poets. Still others came from distant colonies, Magna Graecia in Italy, Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, even Cyrene in North Africa. When they marched together, it stretched across the sanctuary like a living tapestry of Greek identity. Following the athletes were ambassadors, musicians, priests, and representatives of various cities. Many carried offerings, ornate bronze tripods, carved wooden statues, or dedications to Zeus and Hera. Chants and songs accompanied the march, blending reverence with celebration. The procession wound its way past the temples, the treasuries, and finally into the stadium, an elongated bowl carved into the landscape. No seats existed. Spectators stood or squatted on grassy embankments, thousands crowding shoulder to shoulder. When the athletes entered, a roar rose from the spectators, a thunderous greeting from all of Greece. In that moment, differences dissolved. Spartans stood near Athenians without exchanging insults. Argives applauded Corinthians. Families wept with pride as sons stepped into the arena of heroes. The opening procession did more than begin the games. It reminded a fractured world that for 5 sacred days, all Greeks walked the same ground, under the same sky, before the same god. When the procession ended and the athletes took their places, all eyes turned toward the stadium, an elongated grassy field carved directly into the earth. Unlike the marble arenas of later centuries, the early Olympic Stadium had no stone seating, no towering walls, no lavish ornamentation. Its simplicity was intentional. The Greeks believed athletic contests should not distract from the purity of the competition or the presence of the divine. This was not entertainment. This was a sacred test of human excellence before the gods. The stadium stretched roughly 192 meters, the length of one stadion, the unit that gave the world the word stadium. At each end stood starting lines carved into stone, worn smooth by centuries of bare feet. Spectators lined the embankments. Men of all ages, priests with solemn expressions, aristocrats wrapped in fine cloaks, travellers from distant lands, and even philosophers eager to witness physical ideals in motion. Women, however, were barred from attending. Only priestesses of Demeter were permitted inside. For everyone else, the games were strictly a male domain. A hush fell as the herald stepped forward, raising his hand. His voice rang out across the field, announcing the start of the first and most ancient event, the stade race, a full sprint from one end of the stadium to the other. The athletes took their positions, toes pressed into small grooves in the stone, bodies coiled like bowstrings. Their skin glistened with olive oil, dusted lightly with sand to help their grip. There were no lanes, No starting pistol, only the herald's signal. A single trumpet note pierced the air. The runners exploded forward. Spectators roared as the athletes shot across the field, arms pumping, legs kicking up dust. There were collisions, elbows thrown, bursts of desperate speed, as each man sought to prove himself not merely fast, but divinely favoured. Victory was decided by inches. When the first runner crossed the finish line, a wave of shouts swept across the stadium. His name would be recorded for eternity, not as a champion of his city, but as the victor of an Olympiad. But sprinting was only the beginning. The coming days would bring wrestling, boxing, the brutal pancration, chariot races, and pentathlon contests that tested strength, skill, and endurance. Yet standing in that stadium, hearing the thunder of feet and the cries of thousands, one truth became clear. The Olympic Games were more than competition. They were a declaration of human potential, performed under the watchful gaze of Zeus himself. And every athlete who stepped onto that sacred ground knew this was where mortals proved they were worthy of memory. While the sprint opened the games, it was only the first spark in a blaze of competition. The ancient Olympics unfolded as a series of events designed not merely to entertain, but to measure the full spectrum of human ability. To win in Olympia was to achieve a kind of immortality, for the Greeks believed that true excellence, arete, was the closest mortals could come to divinity. One of the most admired competitions was the wrestling match, a contest of strength, balance, and willpower. Wrestlers coated themselves in olive oil and then dust to improve grip. With their hair bound and bodies gleaming, they entered the sandy arena like statues brought to life. Victory went to the athlete who forced his opponent to touch the ground 3 times. The battles were silent, intense, and deceptively graceful. 2 bodies intertwined in a dance that tested every muscle, every breath. Then came boxing, far more brutal than its modern counterpart. Fighters wrapped their hands in leather thongs called himantes, sometimes stiffened with wool or metal. There were no rounds, no weight classes, no time limits. The match ended when someone collapsed, surrendered, or died. Faces were smashed, ribs cracked, and teeth scattered across the sand. Yet spectators revered the boxers, believing their courage honoured Zeus. The pancration, however, was the true test of fearlessness. A blend of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules, it allowed kicking, holds, chokes, throws, and joint locks. Only biting and eye gouging were forbidden, though desperate athletes sometimes attempted them anyway. Victors of the pancration were celebrated as the strongest, most unbeatable warriors of Greece. Olympians who triumphed in this event often went on to command armies or become legends in their cities. The pentathlon showcased versatility: discus, javelin, long jump, a short sprint, and wrestling. Pentathletes were admired for their balance of speed, agility, and precision. Watching a discus arc through the air or a javelin whistle across the field was like witnessing mastery in motion, a reminder that the Olympics celebrated beauty as much as strength. And then there were the equestrian events, held not in the stadium but in the massive hippodrome. Chariot races were chaotic, violent, and exhilarating. Horses collided, chariots overturned, and dust storms swallowed entire teams. But victory brought immense glory, not for the driver but for the wealthy owner who sponsored the team. Every event at Olympia revealed a different side of human excellence. Some showcased precision, others courage, others pure endurance. But all of them, in their own way, paid homage to the gods, proof that mortals could shine brilliantly, even if only for a fleeting moment in the sun. Victory at the ancient Olympics was not decided by medals, nor by national anthems, nor by podium ceremonies. It was determined by a single moment, a judge raising his hand and declaring one name aloud. And with that declaration, an athlete stepped into immortality. Winners were summoned to the temple of Zeus, where the air hung heavy with incense and echoes of hymns. Before the assembly of priests, judges, and thousands of spectators, each victor stood bare-chested, bruised, exhausted, and radiant with triumph. His body bore the marks of combat, scratches from wrestling, swollen knuckles from boxing, dust and sweat dried on his skin, but none of it diminished his glory. To win at Olympia was to be touched by divine favour. The crowning ceremony began with praise to Zeus. A priest cut branches from the sacred olive tree, believed to have been planted by Heracles himself. These branches, long and slender, were woven into a simple wreath, the katinos. No gold, no jewels, just olive leaves, symbols of peace, virtue, and purity. Yet the simplicity was deceptive. This wreath carried more weight than any treasure. It proclaimed to all of Greece that the victor had achieved arete, the highest standard of excellence. His name would be recorded for eternity. His city-state would celebrate him as a hero. Poets might immortalize him. Sculptors might carve his likeness for the altars. Families would speak of him for generations. As the wreath was placed on the victor's head, the crowd erupted, not with polite applause, but with thunderous shouts, chants of his name, and sometimes tears. People who had travelled hundreds of miles felt privileged to witness history. Children stared with shining eyes. Old warriors nodded with respect. Even rivals, those he had defeated, often embraced him, acknowledging the divine nature of his achievement. But the celebration did not end at Olympia. When champions returned home, they were greeted as conquering heroes. City gates were sometimes torn down, so that the victor could enter through a breach, symbolizing that his triumph made the city stronger. Some received free meals for life. Others were granted pensions, statues, or even political office. Yet most champions insisted that these earthly honours were secondary. What mattered most was the wreath itself, the knowledge that they had honoured Zeus, honoured their city, and proven themselves worthy before all of Greece. For in the sacred valley of Olympia, even the briefest moment of victory echoed across centuries, carried by the leaves of a simple olive crown. When the final contest ended and the victors were crowned, Olympia gradually returned to its sacred quiet. Athletes packed their gear, priests extinguished ritual fires, and caravans began the long journey home. But the echo of the games did not fade. It lingered, carried on songs, inscribed on stone, immortalized in memory. What happened in Olympia every 4 years was more than a festival. It was a cultural engine powerful enough to outlive kingdoms, wars, and shifting civilizations. The games became a marker of time itself. Greeks measured history not by dynasties or conquests, but by Olympiads, 4-year cycles that bound the Greek world into a shared timeline. A victory at the Olympics was not simply an athletic achievement. It was a moment etched into the calendar of an entire civilization. Cities boasted of their champions the way others boasted of walls or temples. A single triumph at Olympia could elevate a modest polis into prominence. What made the games truly enduring, however, was their spirit of unity. Every 4 years, rivals became pilgrims, enemies became spectators, and Greece remembered, briefly but powerfully, that it was a cultural family bound by language, religion, and tradition. The Olympics kept alive the idea of a shared Greek identity, even during centuries when politics tore the region apart. Philosophers, playwrights, and historians praised the games as the purest expression of arete, the striving for excellence in body, mind, and soul. As centuries passed, the festival expanded. New events were added. New temples were built. Artists, poets, and sculptors flocked to Olympia to showcase their works. Victors commissioned statues of themselves, some standing proudly, others depicting the exact pose that won their race or match. For many spectators, walking through Olympia felt like walking through a gallery of living legends. But nothing lasts forever. When Rome eventually conquered Greece, the games continued, but gradually changed. Roman emperors competed for glory. Wealth overshadowed purity. Eventually, in the 4th century CE, the Christian Roman Empire banned pagan festivals. Olympia fell silent. Temples crumbled. The sacred fire was extinguished, yet the memory never died. Centuries later, when modern nations sought a symbol of peaceful competition and shared humanity, they looked back to Olympia. They revived the Games not as a religious festival, but as a global celebration of athletic excellence. Today's Olympics, with all their spectacle, technology, and worldwide reach, are descendants of that humble sprint in 776 BCE. What began in a sacred grove with offerings to Zeus became a tradition that spans continents. A reminder that even in a divided world, humanity can unite, if only for a moment, to honour the extraordinary potential of the human spirit.